Hello, English 2327. So I wanted to talk to you today about Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. And so first of all, I need to say that to get a copy of the book, you can go to the left-sided menu on the eCampus page. It's either right over there or right over there. I'm not sure in the world of camera how that works, but anyway. Under Learning Materials, you should have an e-copy of the book. For those of you who like to have a hard copy of the book, I'm with you. And I gave you directions earlier on in the semester. Look for an earlier announcement about how to order your copy from Townsend Press. It's $2. It's the best edition of the Scarlet Letter I've come across so far. So Nathaniel Hawthorne is writing in the mid-1800s about the Pilgrim and Puritan time period in the mid-1600s. So he's writing about a time period 200 years before his own time period. So it would be as if it's 2020 right now, it would be as if you sat down to write about 1820. Now, why was he interested in doing this? He is writing basically to be critical of the Puritan society out of guilt. He has an ancestor who was part of the Salem witch trials, who was a judge in the Salem witch trials, and he is trying to atone, I think, for that miscarriage of justice, and he does so by being openly critical about that society. So that's Nathaniel Hawthorne. In the mid-1800s in which he is writing, it's known as a time period called the Romantic time period. And if you turn to the beginning of the book on page, let's see, yes, on page 4, there's a paragraph there, a long paragraph in the middle of the page. About halfway down through that paragraph, you have a good example of the Romantic time period and the things that they thought. No, they became invested with a quality of strangeness and remoteness. The light and the stillness of the late hour transformed the usually familiar room into a neutral territory, somewhere between the real world and the world of phantoms, a place where the actual and the imaginary may meet. These two worlds, the actual and the imaginary, seem to saturate one another. Each infused the other with its qualities. It became a place where ghosts might enter without frightening us. So the Romantics were very interested in things beyond the physical, and to that end, they were also very much interested in symbolism. Some of the symbolism that Hawthorne uses seems very obvious to us, but that's because we're used to symbolism. They were not. To the people in the Romantic time period in the mid-1800s, they were just like, oh, wow, this is so cool that this represented that, you know? So we're gonna get a lot of primary symbolism, really elementary level symbolism, and as well, this interest in nature, in psychology, in ghosts, things like that is very much typical of his time period. So he's going to, of course, fuse a bit of himself and his own time period into all of his writings. That's just natural. We are a product of the society we grow up in, as was Nathaniel Hawthorne. So he's writing about the mid-1600s, the Puritan society near Boston, and he begins the book with the custom house. He begins the book with a dude who's working at the custom house and says, hey, you know, I was working here and I came across this barrel, which is how they used to transport things. Instead of in cardboard boxes, they transported things in barrels. He said, I came across this barrel and in it was this, wrapped up was this story with this scarlet letter embroidered on a piece of fabric, and it was so cool, and I started to read this story, and that's what's called a framed narrative. He begins the story and he ends the story with this dude in the custom house saying, hey, I came across this story, let me tell you what it said. So we call that a framed narrative. And when we talk about Hawthorne being critical of the Puritan society, I think he's fairly justified, and I think he is not doing them a disservice. I think he is describing them as probably pretty close to how they were. Moreover, I would argue that much of what we see coming out of the Puritan time period, those values, those thoughts are still alive and with us today. We still hold, and when I say we, I mean the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, still hold a lot of these values that are kind of creepy, you know? I know that my parents and grandparents believed a lot like the Puritans did, for example, in that if you were not up and busy by 6 a.m., then you are just morally slothful, you know? That's coming right out of the Puritan time period, you know? So we still do a lot of the things that they did back then. We think we've come so far, and yet we haven't. We still hold a lot of these crummy values with us today, especially when it comes to being judgmental of others. We are very good at that. Now, that can be fun and stuff, but when you bring it into reality instead of just joking around, then it's not so much fun. If you look at chapter 2, the marketplace, tells you everything you need to know about the Puritan society and how judgmental they were of others. You know, they talk about Hester being up there and all of the things they want to do to her in a very uncharitable way. And I have to ask myself, would they have been as judgmental and as critical of the father of this baby if they knew who that father was? And I would argue that no, they would have questioned his morals. They would have looked on him with a frown, you know, but I don't think they would have judged the man as harshly as they judged Hester. What do you think? That is a classic double standard, and is that double standard still alive today? And I ask you to look at examples, and since I'm an English person, I'm going to ask you to look at cues within our own English language. How many words do we have to describe a woman who has looser moral values than we think is appropriate? How many words do we have? A lot. How many words do we have to describe a man who has looser moral values than we think is appropriate? I would be hard-pressed to think of more than one, if even one. You know what I mean? So I think that is a Puritan value that we still hold today. I have no doubt that that they would have been disappointed in the father of the baby if they knew who it was, but they wouldn't have talked about doing to him the things they talked about doing to her as punishment. And what do you want to bet? No man in this time period walked around with a scarlet A on his clothing for all to see. The Puritans believed a lot in public humiliation. In fact, did you notice they closed the schools to watch a public humiliation? They wanted their children to witness a public humiliation, which I think is just barbaric. But anyway, so think about that as you read through the first half of the book. And I also want you to be thinking about what you think about little Pearl. What do you think about Pearl? And we'll talk more about her as we get to the second half of the book, when she becomes a lucid and conscious individual. She's a complicated character. So keep your eye on little Pearl and the things that she does, or the things that you think she may have done, because I think you're probably right. I think she does do some things that are not always very appreciated. One could even say bratty. But anyway, people either love her or they hate her. So see how you feel about little Pearl. And of course, we're going to be talking about some of the aspects of the book that you didn't talk about had you read this before in K through 12, where almost everybody has read some part of this book or some versions of this book, but they won't be touching on some of the things that we will be touching on, some of the more adult themes and things like that. And by adult, I simply mean more about the analysis of the psychology going on, okay? So I should say more mature themes, you know, whatever. But anyway, see if you can access the book under Learning Materials. If you can't, Townsend Press. Townsend Press edition is pretty important because it is the best edition. I don't want you to get into a crappy edition and then think that, oh, I don't like that book. Well, of course you didn't like it because you had a horrible edition of that book. Under Learning Materials, you should see books for all of your courses this semester, including The Scarlet Letter, including The Heretic's Daughter. This one, however, is going to be available at every public library, every half-price books, I mean, it's very popular. And including, if not especially, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we'll talk more about those when we get to that point in the semester. For now, enjoy The Scarlet Letter, and let's talk about it on the discussion board. Okay? I'll see you on the discussion board. Bye.